Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our third session. It's entitled Diaspora ang Pilipino sa Ibayong Dagat, which means overseas Filipinos. And today we have Manang Nadezna or Nadine Ortega, who's a PhD student in political science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, concentrating in indigenous politics and law and society. She is an instructor in the Ilocano Language and Literature program. She is also a mother, a lawyer, activist, feminist, and one of the co-founders of Affirm Hawaii. Manang Nadine, you can take it away.
And welcome, and thank you for joining me in this talk. And organizers, thank you for inviting me to speak on this. I am not an expert by any means necessary, but it is a passion of mine to teach about Philippine history, culture, movements, and to learn about it. I'm always a student journeying in learning, and I like to share with others what I'm learning as well. So again, thank you, Marky, Danny, Chachi, and Anna for inviting me and for organizing this wonderful panel. My family and I moved to Hawaii, the land of Kanaka Maoli, which is currently controlled by the US, and it is a settler colony. So this presentation will re-examine Filipino migration to Hawaii and the United States, not simply as individual aspirations, although it seems that way, and individually it is. But I argue that this is part of a larger history of empire building, slavery, and settler colonialism that enabled the rise of the United States as a capitalist empire. US colonization of the Philippines instituted re-education and other civilizing policies, which groomed Filipinos for industrial labor within and throughout many sites of the US empire. In Hawaii, Filipinos were heavily recruited for the plantation industries and purposefully positioned in the lower stratum in the plantation racial order. And the condition of Filipinos in Hawaii today is a consequence of this colonial encounter, which we will talk about in a little bit. So the coming of Filipinos into Hawaii and the United States is often framed as migration, which means the act, process, or an instance of moving from one country, place, locality to another. So this is a very general term. Migration is a very general term. It is devoid of context and history, and that's why sometimes people use the term diaspora. But I think what's missing in that story is why people move. So it can therefore equate the experiences of diverse groups of people without context and history. For example, the migration of rich New Yorkers to Hawaii, where they buy land, property, and they retire here, is made the same as, say, the migration of Filipino refugees. So those of refugee status entering the United States, for example, during Marcos in the 1970s. What I am attempting to do with this presentation is to provide the context and the history of why and how Filipinos left their ancestral homelands and now occupy lands not of their own. So this is the order in which I will be talking about my presentation. So I'll be talking about the story of Manuel Fragante to start us off, to make connections about the experiences and the condition of Filipinos outside the Philippines, focusing on Hawaii and linking that back to the Philippines, to our history. I think this is also a way where we can give us coming from a place instead of sort of placeless as settlers, as migrants. It's as if we don't come from anywhere, but we do. We come from the Philippines, a place that has a history of colonization. So the mass movement of people from their ancestral lands to another does not just happen without a cause. That cause for Filipinos is US colonization of the Philippines, which resulted in the extraction of Filipino bodies in order to serve the labor demands of the United States. So essentially, we were bred to or trained to serve the United States, our colonial master, and to an extent, even currently. So I will discuss three main points relating to the diaspora of Filipinos. One, that it is a part of a larger project of empire. Two, this comes out of colonial education and training. And three, the racialization or the experience of racism of Filipinos in Hawaii. And then after that, I will go back and look at the case of Manuel Fragante again and link this to the socio-political problem of anti-Filipino race. So let me give you guys the story of Manuel Fragante. And Manang Amy kind of talked about this earlier, but I want to use this as an entry point into what we will be talking about some more in a little bit. So Manuel Fragante was born and raised in the Philippines. He migrated to Hawaii and applied for a job at the Department of Motor Vehicles in 1981. He scored the highest out of 721 test takers in a civil service examination and was placed number 1 on the short list to be interviewed. 2 employees from the DMV interviewed him. They were not Filipino. After the interview, they did not recommend Fragante for the position because of his accent. So they claimed that he had a, quote, very pronounced accent, which is difficult to understand, end quote. Therefore, the DMV notified Fragante that he was not selected for the position. Fragante challenged the employment decision. He sued the city and county of Honolulu. So the U.S. District Court in Hawaii acknowledged that it was because of Fragante's accent that he was not selected for the job. In the court opinion, stated the results of plaintiff's interview showed that his oral communication skills were hampered by his accent or manner of speaking and pronouncing, which made it difficult for the city interviewers to understand his answers and statements during the course of the interview. The court found no discrimination based on race or national origin. Why not? So according to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, Section 2000E-2, this comes from the act. It shall be an unlawful employment practice for an employer to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So Title VII explicitly prohibits discrimination based on race and national origin. Title VII prohibits discriminations like accent when they are stand-ins for race and national origin. So this should be a slam dunk, a victory for Fragante, right? But there is an exception to that rule. Title VII, employers, it allows employers to discriminate, to completely disregard those protections against race, color, sex, religion, when it is, quote, reasonably necessary to the normal operation of that particular business or enterprise, end quote. So this is called the business necessity or the bona fide occupational qualification exception. So here, the Fragante's employer, the city and county of Honolulu, they claim that oral communication was a job necessity. So they claim that Fragante's Filipino accent would not be understood by the general public, and therefore Fragante would not be able to perform the duties of the job. The U.S. District Court ruled in the employer's favor. After that, Fragante appealed the decision, but the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal affirmed the decision of the lower court. It stated that the purpose of Title VII is not only about non-discrimination, but also about the preservation of an employer's to be predicated upon an individual's accent when, but only when, interferes materially with job performance. There's nothing improper about an employer making an honest assessment of the oral communication skills of a candidate for the job when such skills are reasonably related to job performance. So there's many things that people have criticized about this case. And, you know, like Manang Amy stated earlier in her presentation that everybody has an accent, right? I think Professor Mari Matsuda has also written extensively about this, that everybody has accents, but certain accents have meaning associated with them. So they're placed in a hierarchy of accents where certain accents are more favored, certain accents are not, and that reveals the power structure in a given society. And in this case, the Filipino accent is in Hawaii shows where Filipinos are positioned within this hierarchy. So I'm asking, what, if any, is left out of the case, the court documents and decision? What is absent from the law's narrative? So is this legal case just about an individual, just about Fragante? I mean, and typically that's how the law functions, where it's really just one person against another, and the justice and the decision is only for that one person, but it is devoid of context, devoid of history. So who is protected by the law? When Title VII states that it protects persons from discrimination based on race, national origin, color, it recognizes that there is a norm, a standard, a population that exists at the center who's not racialized, who's not raced, who's not colored, who exists within inside the bounds of the nation state, who already belongs. Then there are those populations who exist outside of the norm, who the law has deemed in need of these protections. But in this case, and often many times, the law fails. Instead, it reinscribes the power structure under the facade of equality. So this court case reveals more than the single story of Fragante. It reveals the social condition of Filipinos in Hawaii. Filipinos experience racism in Hawaii and in many parts of the United States and even globally. From the moment of their arrival on these shores in the early 1900s, Filipinos already experienced racism. This case, the Fragante case, reveals the local power structure in Hawaii and a global power structure based on white supremacy. It also further reveals the history of migration and colonialism and the failures of the imperial project. And I will explain that in the rest of my presentation. Here, I will focus on this history. So from the beginning of US colonization of the Philippines, Filipinos were already depicted as inferior, backward, uncivilized, and unfit, and unable to govern themselves. These are the language that they described Filipinos, the colonizers described Filipinos in journals, magazines, letters, colonial account. And these were used as justification for conquest and takeover of the Philippines and Filipinos. So Filipinos were racialized like Native Americans and African Americans, who served as historical precedents and templates for the colonization of the Philippines. In the beginning, the American public did not know much about the Philippines because of the distance of the Philippines to the continental United States. Not very many Americans have gone to the Philippines, and McKinley, the famous story is that he didn't even know where Philippines was in the map, right? Information about it was produced within the context of US colonization. The media, pro-imperialists, colonial officials, soldiers, and travelers who were already acquainted with the US history of westward expansion from the East Coast across the continent to the West Coast. There was already a history of westward expansion and slavery and the logics behind them. And so they utilized familiar constructions of Native Americans and African Americans and applied them to Filipinos as a rationale for colonialism and to position them in a global racial hierarchy. So if you will see in some of the cartoons that a lot of the caricatures of Native Americans and Native people, Native Americans, were, simply just labeled Filipino because they didn't know anything about Filipinos, and they used those same things, the Filipinos as darker skinned, therefore they're all the same. However, despite such racist rhetoric, there was also the belief that Filipinos, nonetheless, could be trained and transformed under American colonial tutelage, especially through education. Schooling was recognized as a necessary component of colonialism. This was evident in the immediate creation of Americanized schooling, the quantity of schools established, and the belief by educators and colonial administrators of the necessity of schooling. The Americanized school system was heavily funded, staffed by about 1,000 American teachers, and was the largest of its kind in the imperial world. American colonial educators and administrators used education to suppress anti-colonial resistance through discipline, training, and surveillance. Educators taught reading and writing, promoted American values, and taught English. Administrators made English language mandatory. So everybody had to learn English in the schools because they recognized the ability of native languages to perpetuate culture and viewed them as obstacles to colonial rule. So this mandatory English policy was entrenched in Philippine society and had long-lasting effects. And to many of us, even here, have experience with this. Filipinos were not allowed to learn their native languages until a generation later. So you guys, I'm sure you guys are familiar with this cartoon. Everybody shows it all the time. And it's like one of my favorite things to show because it really shows, the prevailing attitudes about Filipinos and the new colonies at the time. So here you see the Philippines depicted as Emilio Aguinaldo, the president at the time. Here, Hawaii, which is depicted as a female, so Queen Liliuokalani. We have Puerto Rico and Cuba, and very much front and center at that time. At this time was 1898, under the discipline of this towering figure of Uncle Sam, and he has a stick, which is very phallic and also used as a form of discipline. And we could spend so much more on this picture, but for the interest of time, we're gonna move on. So I have some pictures courtesy of Rebecca Goldschmidt, who shared some of these pictures with me. We have an American school teacher here in the Philippines teaching Filipino kids English. And again, this shows the role of white women in the colonization of Filipinos. Because usually when colonization is depicted, it's usually very patriarchal. I mean, and it is a very patriarchal project, but we forget that sometimes, white women have had roles in the discipline and colonization of other groups. And you can also see, again, like the picture of the cartoon with Uncle Sam in the previous slide, there's like again, like a power differential, right? Like a towering white figure and then smaller colonized subjects. And this is another picture. I want you guys to kind of look at this picture for a little bit. So this is what a colonial school set up in Benguet, in indigenous lands of Benguet people. And you can see them all lined up. There's a sense of order and discipline in the arranging of the colonial subject. And here you can see clearly, again, towering, like it's like really repetitive in a lot of these pictures. It's like a towering symbol of American empire, right? Uncle Sam, white teachers, and here the US flag. Very, again, it's symbolic of the relationship, colonial status of Filipinos and the master, the United States. So the needs of US empire also guided the re-education of Filipinos who were trained and groomed for colonial labor. Because Filipinos were racialized as lacking in capabilities and developmentally behind, their education was constructed to reflect that. This educational training was modeled after industrial schools for Native Americans and African Americans. Filipinos, therefore, were funneled into industrial and mechanical pursuits because that was what educators and administrators believed they were capable of. So it wasn't education for, education's sake, but it was a sort of training for labor. So these racist beliefs influenced their policies and curriculum design. As a result, they de-emphasized higher education and instead focused on industrial training. The colonial relationship between the US and the Philippines and the labor needs of empire also caused and fueled the out-migration of Filipinos. So Filipinos left the Philippines. The demand for cheap labor, coupled with their status as US nationals, made Filipinos targets for heavy recruitment for care work, such as nursing, but also agricultural labor for the US West Coast and plantation economy in Hawaii. And this legacy continues today. Even today, Filipinos are still funneled into, industrial, manual, service-related jobs for men, and also for women, like in tourism and food industry, for example, and then care work for women. So again, you can see how that still is the social order, and that's why we're funneled into things like nursing. We're funneled into certain things like service industry, tourism, etc. I wanted to show you guys these two cartoons. Sorry. Again, a Filipino person carrying Uncle Sam. I mean, this speaks volumes, right, to the relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines, and Filipinos and the U.S. colonizers. That it's titled "The White Man's Burden," but yet we are the one carrying Uncle Sam. And I think Life is one of those magazines that that critiqued, the imperialist practices of the U.S. But even though they critiqued it through cartoons, they still perpetuated some of these racist notions. This other person, this other cartoon, Changing the Load, it says, "Jonathan, you ungrateful skunk, after me knocking off that Spanish burden for you, I guess you ought to be mighty proud and thankful to carry mine." So again, Filipino carrying the burden of American sovereignty. So again, this to me invokes the idea that, for Americans, for white Americans, their sovereignty is, again, comes at the expense of Filipinos. It's through our oppression comes their sovereignty, their freedom. And so, I wanted to also show some pictures of Filipinos being bodies, labor extracted from the Philippines to come to Hawaii in, the sugarcane fields and plantation industries, and also Alaska canneries. So Filipinos were, everywhere doing labor. And again, this was largely men, male labor. Don't forget that Filipino women were also extracted from the Philippines as well as nurses, caregivers, etc. And again, this still happens today. Again, this shows the gendered labor, right? Like women being funneled into kind of like that care work, and men into more labor-intensive jobs, but still labor for the benefit, in order for the U.S. to continue functioning. I like to say, like, we built this damn place. So looking at this history, we see that Filipino migration, Filipino diaspora, because of U.S. colonization of the Philippines, is part of a larger project connected to slavery and settler colonialism. They needed labor after the formal emancipation of enslaved Africans and their descendants. They created a labor force from their colonial subjects. They trained them. These bodies were then extracted from their homelands, come from somewhere, and then to work in Turtle Island in the continental United States, and also in Hawaii, lands of indigenous peoples who were also dispossessed and continue to be dispossessed of their homeland. So now let's go back to Fragante. The story of Fragante highlights the failures and contradictions of the imperial project, where the English language and schooling were consciously and violently imposed on Filipinos. Fragante could be said to be the ideal colonial subject. He was educated in the Americanized school system in the Philippines, which was conducted in English. He had a really good comprehensive vocabulary, and like very good in English. It was almost like his primary language, in fact. Again, very highly educated. He had a long and extensive career in the Philippine military, and also served under the American military, where he received more training in Kansas and Indiana. He was also fervently loyal to not just the Philippines, but also to the United States. And again, we have many parents like that. My dad was he loved the US. However, his experience in Hawaii reveals the fissures and cracks of the purported goals of American schooling, which were claimed as necessary for the growth and progress of Filipinos. The decades of American education did not get Fragante the job. The learning and use of English did not get him the job. Thus, this case reveals the colonial project of schooling was an always already failed project from the onset. It was never meant for us. It was never meant to benefit us. It was meant to colonize and control us. Even if they made these promises that, this is for your benefit, it's actually a failure. It's actually a lie. So Americanized schooling promised to train Filipinos in, quote, democracy, liberty, and equality, end quote, which were asserted as the foundational values of the United States. However, it was never meant to make Filipinos equal to white, nor give them a collective freedom as a people and as a country. De-education through colonial schooling was used to reinscribe Filipinos' coloniality and their position within a global hierarchy. Fragante's story is a story about power. Filipinos are subjugated within the racial hierarchy in Hawaii. Fragante challenged the racial order when he sought an office job. That's not where Filipinos are supposed to be. Filipinos are supposed to be elsewhere, right? Even if the job at the DMV was not a management or professional job, it was a job that was deemed unfit for a Filipino. This case is also about who exists within and outside of the law. So Fragante's particular accent, which is linked to his culture, identity, and history, was used to mark him as illegible, outside the protections of the law. The court refused to recognize his claim of discrimination, as if the interviewers made their determination of Fragante's accent devoid of any historical and cultural influences. The court legitimated the unacceptability of this specific accent, the Filipino accent. This case reveals the perpetuation of the existing power structures. It tells the story of who is seen and unseen. It reveals who belongs and who does not. So there's many scholars who have, talked about and written about the condition of Filipinos in Hawaii. Many scholars have written about the socioeconomic conditions of Filipinos. We are overrepresented in the service industry. We have the lowest pay amongst the major ethnic groups. Our educational attainment is lower than other groups. The higher we go in the educational pursuit, like higher education, the less representation of Filipinos. Even if Filipinos make up about 20-something% of the population. And also health, many scholars have written about Filipino health, that we are riddled with many diseases. Again, that's due to poverty and, and connected to all of these other conditions, right? Others have also talked about our encounters with the law. In the beginning of the plantation days, Filipinos were criminalized. Filipino men specifically were criminalized, and we were the most hanged in Hawaii law. Again, other people like Professor Labrador and Okamura have written about representation and the media of Filipinos, that there's many racist imagery and narratives about Filipinos. So all of these things, sorry, let me just go back to that for now. All of these things all together are connected. It shows that there's a larger problem of racism against Filipinos in Hawaii. But why don't we talk more about the effects of racism on our lives? How does this racism affect us? I was just in the chat in the previous panel about the food, and that's also connected. Like the this idea about our food as gross or like unappealing. All of that is again part of this. We are taught to think negatively about anything related to Filipinos, about who we are, about the food that we consume, about the colors that we like, um, about who we are, what we look like. So we need to talk more about how this racism affects us internally. How does encountering racism in all of its forms, like first we need to identify what these are, and then how does it affect us internally? How do we feel about this? And I think we need larger conversations about that. And so let me just talk to you guys a little bit about my story. So I am an immigrant and I came here when I was 10 to Hawaii, and I went to the public schools. I was in Paoa Valley Elementary School. I was in Kawananakoa Intermediate, and then I went to Roosevelt, and then I was at UH since forever. And in the public schools, in those encounters with other kids, it's like a microcosm of the larger society, right? And so kids are cruel, and then they perpetuate those same narratives, racist rhetorics, to each other, amongst each other. And so when I entered Paoa Elementary School, I was the new kid, I was an immigrant, and they made fun of my Filipino-ness, my accent. So I got teased a lot. I was like the outsider. And there weren't a lot of Filipinos in Paoa because it's closer to town and it's not a hub of, the like Filipino community. And so I was bullied. And, going through months and months of that, it began to affect me, and I stopped speaking in school. And how can you if you think about it, a 10-year-old stopping speaking in school is a huge deal. And I became ashamed of who I was, and I learned to police how I spoke. And so I had to get rid of that accent. I had to blend in. And I was, that is really how I lived my life until I went to college. And you forget how all of these things shape who you are, and you police your behavior based on all of these things that people say about you. And only until college did I, take ethnic studies and IP classes, for example, did I begin to learn like, oh, this is not okay. And this is why I've began researching about Filipinos, and my dissertation is about anti-Filipino racism and activism. And I am an activist, and so this is what I do. I'm showing you guys this picture of the things that I do. I am part of a feminist activist organization, Affirm Hawaii. And also I helped co-found Laing Hawaii, a nonprofit org teaching Ilocano and Visayan, Cebuano in the community. So, our struggles is not just a story of struggle, but it's also about the story of resistance. So I wanted to share this with you guys and with something more positive. And if you guys want to, talk more about, if you guys want to talk more about like some of these issues and how you can get involved outside of electoral politics, and electoral politics is great, but there's also some problems with that. And I think activism and changing the culture and battling, like making connections with, Kanaka Maoli and other racialized groups in Hawaii, we can topple this empire and build a better society for all of us. So again, when we think about land back struggles of Native Hawaiians and Native Americans, that's also important to us in having that history in the Philippines, because our land is not free, and we're not free until we are all free. So
Thank you so much, Manang, for sharing your story. I see.
That's it.
I know many of
Danny,
us here
take it
might share
away.
similar stories as well. One of the things for me, I think that's eye-opening was the fact that everyone has an accent, and how you started with the Manuel Fragante case, and so. But with that, the social hierarchy is given more powers. Extending from that, could you explain more, how do we address racism within our own culture among Filipinos of different regions in the Philippines and abroad? And then with like what you mentioned in allying with other well, how do we address racism that we have?
So this is a really tough question, actually. It's complex, right? I mean, because when we think about Filipinos, we cannot forget that the category of Filipino is also socially constructed. So in the Philippines, it's home to many different kinds of Filipinos, and that's also a different context where different groups of people are also hierarchized, right? There's different power structure operating in the Philippines, and but at the same time, racism is a whole structure and a system, right? We were not racist. We were taught to be racist, and so the idea of racism, how should I say this? Is taught by colonization, and we have to understand how we are also connected because of the ways that we are racialized. How racism is directed towards us is connected to the racism that we also perpetuate against other people. So I know that in the Filipino community, anti-Blackness is a huge problem, and so approximated to Blackness in different parts of the world, and in Hawaii, and as other groups as well. So if you hate other people, then you're also hating yourself. So racism it affects people in different ways. Anti-Blackness is not just about Black people. Angela Davis says the assumption is that anti-Blackness only affects Black people, but it does not. It affects different people as well who are racialized depending on their proximity to whiteness and proximity to Blackness, and we all fall somewhere in that middle, depending on all of these intersections of class, citizenship, gender, sex, sexuality, and all of this stuff. I hope I answered your question. Does anybody in the chat want to also share your manao, your insights?
Thank you, Mani. It looks like
Feel free.
Everyone knows that this topic is very timely as well. One of the questions that we came up with was, how do we educate those who don't understand, like especially with more recently the Black Lives Matter movement, and if our older generations, like our parents or our grandparents, they don't quite understand, how do we bridge that gap?
I'm really impressed with the younger generation. I think they are more they're more conscious than we give them credit for. Case in fact, you organizers of this panel, because of social media and just all of these things erupting, I think the younger generation is conscious and also politically activated, and they know what's going on, because in my classes you know, I am so impressed by the analysis of many of these students who know what's happening, who knows how to link it um, the Filipino struggle. And I think I'm hopeful that I'm very hopeful that the world will change because of the younger generation. But for those that might not be as active, and even our older our elders, I think it's really just talking and coming from a place of love. And for me, it's just I don't really have that problem because my mom is so like she knows. Both of my parents were always like really like thinking about politics and all of this stuff. But it's really just for me, I think it's to just talk about your experiences and to link different things, different struggles. I think stories and like personal stories about your struggles, about like humanizing like Black people, Native Hawaiians, for examples, and linking those struggles. If we can see how those struggles are connected in history and even today, I think they will understand. um and I don't think we need like sort of like my presentation, which is super like fancy language and all of that. I think, just talking and just sharing stories, I think is impactful. And for those that kind of like want to get involved, there's so many different Filipino groups out there in Hawaii that are doing all of this work, like Affirm, Laing, the Colonial Pinays, for example, and even others not connected with any organizations. We have many people that we can look up to now, that have been working, and now I think we need new leaders. We need new like the younger generation to
Thank you,
lead
Mong. I think
us.
that's super powerful. I think reading that to myself, like recently, I gave a call to my grandma, and she's the one that initiated a conversation with me about politics because she was listening to the radio. And she's like, "So, who are you voting for, and why do you have those feelings?" So I think storytelling is really powerful, and just starting that conversation as well, no matter what the topic may be. Um, yeah. And I also wanted to make this other question. If anyone else has any questions as well, feel free to ask it in the chat and we'll get to it. So this other question, you talked about how education wasn't meant to educate us, it was meant to colonize us. So in the diaspora, how can we resist this reality, especially, for example, more recently, like we were talking about with Dr. Amy, with the proposed cutting of the Philippine Languages and Literatures program, it seems like it's happening again. In the Philippines, they try to silence our native tongues, and then now we see that as well in the diaspora. So how can we resist that?
So I want to preface this by saying that it's complicated, right? Like education is a way for us to also learn about some of the things that we didn't learn, let's say in high school, in primary school. But at the same time, you can see how such we're not supposed to get up that high, because like if you think about, like, check out the UH website, and I think Manang Amy talked about this, like 12% of Filipinos in undergrads or something, and 7% or 6% in graduate and professional schools. There's like 2% faculty, and so you can see already this place is not a place for Filipinos. But that doesn't mean that we don't push and still say, no, we need to be here, because education is a gateway to other places. It has value, and but it's also a way for us to learn about our condition, about our history, and that can radicalize. Talk about education is both a double-edged sword. So settler colonial society, all of the institutions within it perpetuate, we participate in it until we can find a way to dismantle the whole damn thing and build a better future for us. So we participate, but we have to think and build. We have to build.
I think that was very powerful in that we are here. we're participating, but we have to build as well. A question in the chat from Catherine Achacoso. Building from that question, what does decolonial education look like for Filipinos in the diaspora?
Catherine, you can answer this question better than me. How do you find a space in the settler colony to, to build something that is not colonial? I mean, I think you just do your best. And some of the things that I've participated in, I'm not sure if like they're the best, but we're trying, right? Like a feminist activist organization, Affirm, for example, and then Laing. This was this was just a language program. Even though I've had this dream before about a Filipino immersion school, for example. This is a program that a bunch of us, Anthony, Yvette, Rebecca Goldschmidt, and I helped kind of dream and build, and then now they're doing most of the building of a place where we can learn about our language. So learning your language is resistance, because we're told that our languages are not valuable, right? Learn English. It's gonna get you that job, because what's the point of learning Ilocano or whatever? That's what they tell us, right? And so, but also in the curriculum of Ilaing, which I sometimes guest lecture, is also like learning about the history of colonization, food systems. How do we grow our own food? How is our our place here bring tension with Native Hawaiians, for example, because this is not our place. So like thinking about these questions, it's just, I don't have the best question, Catherine, answer for this, Catherine. I'm not the best at on the spot answering either. But we just try. I mean, because look at Native Hawaiians, for example. Their population was almost decimated because of the violence of colonization. There was only like 100 speakers of Hawaiian, and they resisted. They built and kept building and are still building even today. So I want to say that decolonization, decolonial education, decolonial resistance is an ongoing process. We have to keep building. We have to keep, every single time we resist, there's always something that keeps on pushing us back. So we're always going to meet that tension, meet that conflict with something else.
Manang, yeah, and that's part of the reason that why Manang Chachi suggested we do the Indigenous land acknowledgement when starting this conference as well.
But also, I think it's not just acknowledgement. I want us to like really be there. I mean, like not just sort of like social media, like Native Hawaiians at the Mauna, like we gotta show up for them. Because like if we show up for other people and make all of these connections, people also show up for us, because then we understand how all of these things are really connected, and we need to be free. Because this is not acceptable. Filipinos dying of COVID, Native Hawaiians on the Mauna, like their mountain is being desecrated. Those things are the same things. And so we need to understand how those are related. So
thank you, Manang. And I think we'll take this last question from Jonathan Ibanez. You shared a lot about your story. So what inspires you to maintain your attitude of resistance?
So I shared my story with you guys, and I'm still not okay from me not speaking for a whole year in 6th grade. Like when I speak, and I still speak, my voice, I get super nervous. I have to remind myself to take like little breaths in between, because then my voice shakes. That's the impact of that, of not speaking, of like having to like shut up and not talk, like because I'm not supposed to be here. And also I see my mom like working, like just a few years ago she was working 2 jobs, and just but that hurts. when we can't survive with one job. I can see it reading my students' papers, their essays, show this same pain, the same struggles in different ways, but it's still there. And so, how can you not fight when that's what you're dealing with, and that's what your parents are dealing with, and that's what your students are dealing with? It's there, and it hurts. And instead of feeling kind of like, oh crap, I can't do anything, what if we fight? What would that look like?
Thank you, Manang. Yeah, I do see that in my own family as well. So many of them have to work double jobs just to get by, even 2 or 3 jobs even. And I relate that to how we have to resist and we have to build and come together because we share the struggle. And yeah. Thank you so much, Manang, for sharing your story. That concludes this session. If you guys want to head over back to the sessions tab, we're going to start session 4, Empire of Care, Health Disparities Within Filipino Communities. We have a few panelists there, so we'll see you there. Thank you again, Manang Nadine.